How the USAF used fake runways to confuse enemy bombers. September 17, 1943. 1430 hours. Skies over northern France near Calais. Hauptmann Klaus Weber gripped the stick of his FW-190, eyes locked on the target below, an sprawling Allied airfield, fresh runways gleaming under the autumn sun, lined with what reconnaissance swore were dozens of parked B-17s and Lancasters, ready for the next raid on the Reich. His squadron of 40 fighters dove in formation, engines roaring, cannons primed. Intelligence had marked this as a high-priority site, American engineers expanding it just weeks after D-Day planning whispers, runways extended for heavy bomber ops, fuel dumps brimming. Weber's orders were clear: strafe the aircraft, crater the runways, cripple the USAF's push into Europe. But as he closed to 500 meters, something jarred. The lead B-17 shuddered unnaturally under a burst from his 20mm shells. Not metal crumpling, fabric ripping. Canvas wings billowed like sails in the wind, revealing wooden struts beneath, the entire fuselage deflating into a heap of painted plywood and deception. What Weber couldn't see from altitude reports was the scale of the illusion. 2,000 feet of fake runway, laid with chicken wire and canvas strips painted black to mimic tarmac cracks, surrounded by 50 dummy bombers, each a 48-hour carpentry marvel costing pennies and scrap timber from real aircraft crates. No engines hummed. No ground crew scrambled in panic. Instead, a handful of Allied troops, British and American engineers working side by side, emerged laughing from hidden foxholes, waving salvaged propellers at the circling Luftwaffe like taunting flags. The flak bursts, lazy smoke pots, timed for show. The fuel trucks, plywood shells that splintered on impact, spilling nothing but air. If the Germans pressed on blindly, as orders demanded, they'd burn irreplaceable fuel. 43 minutes round trip on rationed avgas for zero gain, tying down squadrons while real USAF bases in East Anglia launched unchallenged. This wasn't just a dummy site, it was one of 237 across the Allied network, part of Operation Fortitude's Grand Theater, where fake runways drew 15 German divisions to the wrong invasion coast, wasting months of panzer reserves on phantoms. The revelation would shatter Wehrmacht logistics doctrine. An enemy so abundant, they built entire shadow air forces from leftovers, outproducing Germany 20-1 in aircraft while staging sideshows to bleed the Luftwaffe dry. Within weeks, Weber's pilots would question every recon photo, every briefing. Real runways blending into fiction, uncertainty paralyzing raids. Over the next year, these deceptions would save thousands of Allied lives, paving the way for Normandy's real storm. The Germans, pioneers of blitzkrieg, faced a new tyranny. Not supply lines, but surplus. American industrial might, funneled through USAF ingenuity and British craftsmanship, turned waste into warfare's ultimate weapon, illusions that struck deeper than any bomb. Weber banked away, sweat soaking his flight suit, the laughter echoing in his headset. They thought it was a base. It was a trap, and the Allies were just getting started. Estimated, read time, 45 seconds. The canvas snapped in the slipstream. Hauptmann Klaus Weber saw it at 500 meters, close enough to smell the cordite from his own cannons, close enough to read the tail markings on what should have been a Lancaster bomber. His FW-190 screamed past the target, 20mm shells punching neat holes through metal that rang wrong, metal that bent wrong, and then his brain caught up with what his eyes were showing him. The Lancaster's port wing was flapping. Canvas. Painted canvas stretched over a wooden frame, now torn by his gunfire, billowing in the September wind like laundry on a line. "Break! Break!" someone shouted on the radio, maybe Lieutenant Fisher, maybe himself. Weber hauled back on the stick, pulling out of the dive that had begun 3 kilometers up with such certainty. Behind him, 40 Luftwaffe fighters followed their leader down toward what intelligence had marked as an active RAF bomber base near Calais. Fresh construction, high-value targets. Worth burning the fuel they no longer had enough of, worth the risk. The flak burst around them in lazy black puffs. Too lazy, too scattered. Weber's hands tightened on the controls as more details registered. The fuel truck near the hangar. Plywood. He could see the grain of the wood now, see where someone had painted shadows to suggest weight and roundness. The dispersal pens were canvas sheets stretched over lumber frames. The entire fucking hangar was a wooden shell that his wingman's cannon shells had just punched through like cardboard. Because it was cardboard. Or close enough. Fisher's FD-190 pulled up beside him, the pilot's head swiveling in the cockpit. Through his canopy, Weber saw Fisher's mouth working, but no words came through the radio. Just static and the background chatter of confused voices. German discipline fragmenting into questions nobody wanted to ask. The airfield sat below them in perfect detail. Recent tire tracks scarred the grass. Oil stains darkened the tarmac near the maintenance areas. Wind socks fluttered from their poles. Everything looked right, because everything was designed to look right from exactly this altitude, in exactly this light, through exactly the kind of cameras mounted in reconnaissance aircraft. But Weber was at 200 meters now, circling, and from here the illusion shattered. The Lancaster he'd hit wasn't just damaged, it had collapsed. No aircraft breaks that way. Metal crumples. Canvas tears and hangs limp. The bomber was deflating like a punctured toy, wooden ribs visible through the painted fabric skin. Then he saw the men on the ground. They weren't running for cover. They weren't manning the anti-aircraft guns that had thrown up that pathetic excuse for flak. They were standing in the open, faces turned upward toward 40 German fighters that could strafe them into paste. And they were laughing. Weber could see it. Mouths open, shoulders shaking. One man bent double with hands on his knees. Another soldier picked up something from the ground near a collapsed aircraft and waved it over his head. A wooden propeller blade. He held it like a flag, like a trophy, shaking it at the circling fighters in a gesture that transcended language. You fell for it. You absolute fools. Form up, Weber said into his radio. His voice came out steady, professional. Inside his flight suit, his undershirt was soaked through with sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature. All aircraft, return to base. Hauptmann, we have ordnance remaining. I said return to base. The flight back took 43 minutes. Weber counted every one of them. Fuel gauges dropping. The French coast falling away behind them. The fighters peeling off one by one toward their dispersed airfields. Each pilot carrying back the same corroding knowledge. They'd burned fuel they couldn't replace to destroy targets that weren't there. But it was worse than that. Weber kept seeing the man with the wooden propeller, kept seeing that gesture of mockery, and kept understanding what it meant. The British had built this, not hastily, not desperately. They'd constructed an entire airfield. Buildings, aircraft, vehicles, all of it. Purely to waste German effort. The lumber alone would have built barracks for 2 companies. The paint would have camouflaged real facilities. The manpower, the planning, the deliberate construction of something designed to be destroyed. Only an enemy with resources to spare could afford such waste. The thought sat in Weber's gut like spoiled meat. For 3 years he'd listened to the briefings about British weakness, American bluster, enemy production figures that were obviously exaggerated propaganda. The Reich's intelligence had been clear. Keep pressing, keep pushing. The Allies were close to breaking. But enemies close to breaking didn't build elaborate theater sets to draw raids. They didn't staff those sets with soldiers who laughed at attacking fighters instead of cowering in bunkers. They didn't invest time and materials in jokes. Weber landed at Abbeville at 1640 hours. The ground crew swarmed his FW-190, already calculating fuel usage, counting remaining ammunition. The math would look bad. Every shell fired at canvas. Every liter of fuel spent reaching a target that existed only on maps and in imagination. "Sir," his crew chief said, "the mission?" Weber climbed out of the cockpit, legs unsteady. The airfield around him looked suddenly suspect. Was that fuel truck real? Were those supply crates actually full? How did you tell any more? Successful, he said, because what else could he say? All aircraft returned. That night, someone posted reconnaissance photos in the operations room. New images from earlier that day taken after the raid. Weber stared at them with a dozen other pilots, nobody speaking. The British had already started rebuilding. Fresh lumber, new canvas, a team of perhaps 30 men working in the September sunlight, hammering together replacement Lancasters on the same runway where Weber had destroyed their predecessors just hours before. They were rebuilding faster than Germany could destroy. One of the younger pilots, barely 19, still convinced the war would be won by Christmas, pointed at a detail in the photo. At least we damaged their facilities, sir, made them waste resources on repairs. Weber looked at the kid, remembered being that certain once. Remembered believing the intelligence briefings, the propaganda, the assurances that German technical superiority would inevitably triumph. Yes, he said, we made them waste resources. He didn't say what he was thinking, that the British could waste resources, that this entire elaborate farce was proof of abundance, not scarcity. That somewhere in England there were factories churning out wooden aircraft frames with the same industrial efficiency other factories used to build real bombers. That Germany was fighting an enemy who could afford to play games. The reconnaissance photos stayed pinned to the board. Over the following weeks, more raids went out against the dummy field. The British kept rebuilding. The Luftwaffe kept attacking. The cycle continued with mechanical inevitability, everyone involved knowing it was theater but unable to stop performing their roles. 3 weeks later, Weber shot down his 12th Allied aircraft, a real one this time, a Spitfire that burned satisfyingly when his cannon shells found the fuel tank. He felt nothing. The victory rang hollow, because he kept seeing those canvas wings, that wooden propeller, those laughing faces. Kept understanding that the war had shifted into dimensions the briefings never covered, dimensions where truth and fiction blurred, where the enemy's greatest weapon was excess. The ability to waste was itself a kind of strength, and Germany had nothing left to waste. The reconnaissance photographs arrived at Weber's aerodrome 3 days after his mortifying encounter with the canvas Lancasters. Hauptmann Klaus Weber stood in the briefing room, watching his commanding officer tap the fresh images with a gloved finger. Same target. They've rebuilt everything. Weber leaned closer. The fake airfield looked pristine. 6 new bombers dispersed exactly where his squadron had shredded the previous ones. Fresh hangar roofs gleamed in the autumn sunlight. Even the fuel truck he'd personally demolished was back, parked in the identical position. 48 hours, the intelligence officer said quietly. They replaced the entire installation in 2 days. Weber felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, not frustration, something closer to vertigo, the sensation of standing on ground that should be solid but isn't. By December 1943, the fake airfield near Calais had been attacked 7 times. Weber flew 3 of those missions himself. Each time, the British rebuilt. Sometimes they improved the designs, better paint, more convincing shadows. Once they'd added washing hung between buildings, tiny shirts and trousers flapping in the wind at 0800 hours, right when German reconnaissance usually flew. The ritual became grotesque. Luftwaffe fighters would dive, expend irreplaceable ammunition shredding plywood, then limp home on fumes. Intelligence would photograph the damage. Within days, new photos would show perfect reconstruction. Orders would come down. Hit it again. They're mocking us, Oberleutnant Heinrich Braun said during one briefing, his voice tight. They want us to keep coming back. Nobody argued. The evidence was impossible to deny. The British were rebuilding faster than Germany could destroy. Carpenters working overnight outpaced Luftwaffe fighters burning fuel Germany didn't have to spare. Then came the photograph that made it explicit. The morning reconnaissance pilot, a boy of 19 who'd transferred from the Eastern Front, delivered the images personally. His hands shook slightly as he laid them on the briefing room table. "Sir, you need to see this." Major Ernst Hoffman bent over the photos. The fake airfield filled the frame, still showing damage from yesterday's raid. Splintered Lancasters, collapsed hangar walls, the usual devastation. But in the center of the runway sat something new. Hoffman lifted the magnifying glass. The object measured roughly 6 feet long, painted in RAF olive drab, positioned with geometric precision on the runway's centerline. Sunlight caught white lettering stenciled along its side. German words, carefully rendered. Holz for Holz. Wood for wood. It was a bomb. A wooden bomb. A perfect replica of a British 500-pounder carved from timber and painted to match the real thing from altitude. The craftsmanship was meticulous. Even the tail fins showed proper angles, proper proportions. Hoffman set down the magnifying glass. The room had gone absolutely silent. "They left us a gift," Braun said finally. His voice sounded hollow. Nobody laughed. Weber found himself staring at that photograph, unable to look away. The wooden bomb sat there like a monument to absurdity, a punchline to a joke that kept getting darker. The British weren't just rebuilding decoys. They were annotating them, providing commentary, treating the entire operation like theater that required program notes for the slower members of the audience. The implications spiraled outward like cracks in glass. Someone had authorized building that wooden bomb. Someone had carved it. Someone had painted the inscription in German, which meant they had German speakers in their dummy airfield crew, ensuring the message would land perfectly. Someone had placed it with surveyors. Precision on the runway, knowing exactly when reconnaissance would photograph it. This wasn't improvisation. This was production value. "They're saying they know," Hoffman said quietly. "They know we know it's fake. They know we keep attacking anyway, and they think it's funny." Weber's wingman, a veteran of 40 missions, spoke up. "Sir, request permission to strike the target again. Destroy that thing." Denied. Hoffman didn't look up from the photograph. "That's exactly what they want. More fuel wasted, more ammunition expended, another raid they can photograph and rebuild in 2 days. Then what do we do?" The question hung unanswered. That wooden bomb appeared in 15 separate reconnaissance photographs over the following week. It sat there like a gravestone, like a flag planted on conquered territory. Every pilot in the squadron saw the images. Nobody spoke about it directly, but the photographs circulated, passed from hand to hand in the mess hall, studied by candlelight in quarters, becoming something closer to religious iconography than intelligence material. Weber found himself dreaming about it. In his nightmares, he'd strafe the wooden bomb with all 8 cannons firing, watch his shells punch through it, and it would remain intact, immovable, the inscription still legible. Wood for wood. In one dream, the bomb grew until it filled the entire runway, then the entire airfield, then the horizon itself, that message repeating across its surface like wallpaper. He woke up with his sheets soaked in sweat. The psychological mechanics were perfectly calibrated. The wooden bomb proved the British understood everything, understood German intelligence procedures, understood the command structure that kept ordering futile raids, understood the Luftwaffe's growing fuel crisis that made every wasted sortie more painful. And rather than simply letting the farce continue in silence, they'd chosen to narrate it, to provide running commentary. To ensure everyone involved recognized the absurdity while being powerless to stop it. It was strategic humiliation dressed as comedy. By late December, even High Command acknowledged the trap. Orders came down. Cease attacks on confirmed decoy installations. Focus limited resources on legitimate targets. But the wooden bomb remained in reconnaissance photos for months. The British never moved it. They left it there through winter snow and spring rain. This permanent monument to the moment mockery became a weapon system. Pilots heading to other targets would see it in passing, that 6-foot punchline growing weathered but still legible. "They made it last," Braun observed once, studying a March 1944 photograph. "It's still there. They could have removed it after we stopped attacking, but they kept it. Weber understood why. The wooden bomb wasn't just for German pilots, it was for British morale. Proof their carpenters were winning a very real battle with Luftwaffe fighters, it taught. Was for British intelligence. Evidence their deception operations worked at psychological levels that transcended mere tactical success. It was for history, a photographic record of the moment warfare became theater and one side could afford better props. Most of all, it was a message about abundance. Only an enemy with resources to spare builds elaborate jokes into their defensive systems. Only an enemy who's already won can afford to waste lumber, paint, and man-hours on mockery. The wooden bomb said, while you're fighting for survival, we're making art projects. Weber never flew against that airfield again, but he kept one reconnaissance photograph in his logbook, the clearest image of that wooden bomb, inscription sharp and centered. Holds für Holz. After the war, he would carry it across 3 decades, through denazification and reconstruction, through his career with Lufthansa and eventual retirement. He'd show it to students, to historians, to anyone who asked what finally broke the Luftwaffe's confidence. This, he'd say, tapping the photograph, this is when we knew. Not that we were losing, we'd known that for months, but that we were fighting an enemy who'd already won and was now just playing with us, like children with wooden toys. The bomb itself likely rotted away in some British salvage yard, broken up for scrap timber in 1945 or 46, but the photographs remained. Evidence preserved in filing cabinets and archives, the moment strategic deception achieved perfect execution, when a 6-foot joke became more devastating than any actual bomb, when wood became weaponized and the enemy's laughter echoed louder than cannon fire. The morning air carried the scent of April rain mixing with cordite. Oberleutnant Heinrich Braun watched the target materialize below, another Allied dummy field, this one near Abbeville, 15 kilometers from where Weber had found the wooden bomb. His 20mm cannon selectors clicked to ready position with that satisfying mechanical snap that meant business. Through his gun sight, everything looked correct. A B-17 Flying Fortress sat on dispersal, wings reflecting the weak spring sun. Ground crew swarmed around it. 5 figures moving with purpose near the bomb bay. Fuel truck parked 30 meters distant. Even the tire tracks in the mud looked fresh. "Easy target," he muttered, squeezing the trigger. The cannon shook his fighter like a hammer blow. Shells walked across the bomber's fuselage in textbook strafing pattern, left to right, center mass. The B-17 came apart exactly as expected, metal peeling back from wooden ribs beneath, plywood shredding into splinters. Then one of the ground crew screamed. The sound cut through his engine noise, through the wind rush, through every assumption Braun carried about what was happening below. The figure went down, and the scream didn't stop. Braun's hands froze on the stick. The next cannon burst went wild, kicking up mud 20 meters from the fallen man. Because that's what it was now, not a figure, not a silhouette. A man, clutching his side where 20mm fragments had found flesh instead of canvas. Blood spread across the fake tarmac. Real blood. Arterial red against gray concrete painted to look weathered. The other ground crew weren't dummies either. They moved. Actual human movement, not the static poses of mannequins Braun had strafed at a dozen other decoy sites. 2 men sprinted toward the fallen soldier. A third dove behind the plywood fuel truck, smart enough to know more fighters might follow. Braun hauled his FTW 190 into a climbing turn, banking hard to see what his guns had done. The man was still moving, still screaming, though Braun couldn't hear it anymore over the altitude gain. But he could see it. The open mouth, the hands pressed to a stomach wound, the way his legs kicked against the pain. Medics rushed from a Nissen hut that Braun had assumed was another prop. They carried an actual stretcher. Their uniforms showed creases, wear, the distinction between theater and reality. His wingman's voice crackled. "Good hits, Heinrich. You got the servicing crew." "Pull up," Braun said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. "Abort the run." "What? We have 3 more passes." "Abort!" The second fighter peeled away, confused but obedient. Braun kept climbing, kept watching the scene shrink below. The medics reached the wounded man. One immediately pressed gauze to the wound, real gauze, soaking through immediately. The other flagged down an ambulance that emerged from behind a hangar, a vehicle that ran on petrol instead of paint and illusion. They were dying for plywood. The thought wouldn't leave him during the flight back to Abbeville. He tried to process the mathematics of what he'd witnessed. Real soldiers, real casualties, actual blood spilled defending a fake target. The Allies were putting breathing men on dummy airfields, issuing them rifles and bandages and orders to maintain the deception unto death. The abundance this implied made his throat close. Germany pulled men from universities, from factories, from farms, conscripting teenagers and invalids to fill gaps in real combat units. Every soldier was precious, irreplaceable, a resource carefully allocated to sectors where they might actually matter. The Luftwaffe couldn't afford to station fighters at false airfields. They barely had fuel to patrol real ones, but the British could garrison illusions. They could spend lives, actual human lives, as set dressing for their theatrical productions. The waste wasn't in materials anymore. It was in people, and they had enough to spare that bleeding for fake bombers made strategic sense. Braun's hands shook on the stick as Abbeville's real runway appeared ahead. He counted the fighters dispersed around the field. 11. That's all his group had left operational. 11 aircraft to defend an entire sector, while the enemy staffed phantom bases with warm bodies. The landing was rough. He forgot to compensate for crosswind, touching down hard enough to compress the gear struts violently. Ground crew ran toward his fighter, concerned by the sloppy approach. Braun sat in the cockpit for 2 minutes after shutdown, unable to make himself climb out. That night, he found Weber in the officers' mess, both of them nursing the watery beer that was all the quartermaster could scrounge. "They're bleeding," Braun said without preamble. Weber looked up from his logbook. "What?" "The dummy fields. Real soldiers. I hit one today." Braun's voice stayed flat, documentary. 20-millimeter fragments. Stomach wound. Medics treated him right there on the fake tarmac while I watched. Weber set down his pencil. His face showed no surprise, only a kind of tired recognition, like he'd been waiting for someone else to see it too. "The field near Abbeville?" Weber asked. "Yes." "They've had troops there for 2 weeks. Reconnaissance photographed them building a new dummy B-24 on Tuesday. Real men, real hammers, fake airplane." Weber pulled out a photo from his logbook. The wooden bomb, that cursed monument to British mockery. This was the warning. Wood for wood. We just didn't understand what they meant. They're dying for props. They can afford to. Weber's voice carried the weight of months watching this arithmetic play out. That's the message. They have so many men that garrisoning deceptions with actual soldiers makes sense. We're killing real people who are defending fake targets, and it still serves their purpose because it wastes our ammunition on nothing that matters. Braun thought of the medics, the stretcher, the ambulance. All real, all deployed to protect plywood. How many bases? Intelligence says over 200 across England and Scotland. Maybe half have real troops now, mixed with dummies we can't distinguish from altitude. Weber closed his logbook. Every raid could be shooting canvas, or people. We won't know until the shells hit. The implications spread like poison. Braun couldn't strafe dummy fields anymore without risking actual casualties, but he also couldn't ignore them, because intelligence couldn't tell real from fake until someone bled. The British had weaponized uncertainty, turned reconnaissance into Russian roulette with human lives as the bullet, and they could afford it. That was the part that kept circling back, the truth that made everything else possible. They had soldiers to waste on deception. Germany was scraping the bottom of manpower reserves while the Allies staffed theatrical productions with warm bodies, knowing some would die for the performance but having enough in reserve that it didn't matter. "What did he look like?" Weber asked quietly. Braun closed his eyes. Young, dark hair, couldn't see much else from altitude, but I saw his mouth open when the fragments hit. Saw him go down. He paused. Saw him keep screaming. They sat in silence, nursing beer that tasted like tin, in a mess hall that smelled of mildew and defeat. Outside, mechanics were cannibalizing 2 fighters to keep 9 flying. Inside, 2 pilots confronted the arithmetic of an enemy so wealthy in men they could spend them on lies. The wooden bomb appeared in Braun's dreams that night, its inscription transformed. Wood for wood, blood for plywood. The man he'd shot crawled across fake tarmac forever, bleeding real blood for an illusion, while British carpenters hammered together fresh bombers in the background, and medics lined up with more stretchers, and the ambulance circled back for another load. They had enough. The nightmare repeated that truth with each loop. The Allies had enough soldiers that death's defending deceptions still left surplus, enough that the strategic calculus, tie down German fighters, waste German ammunition, force German intelligence to investigate every phantom, justified real casualties. When Braun woke at 0400, his sheets were soaked with sweat. He'd killed 17 enemy aircraft in combat. He knew what killing looked like, but those were soldiers who chose to fly into his guns, who died fighting for objectives that mattered. The man at Abbeville had died guarding plywood, and somewhere British planners had looked at that possibility and decided, acceptable loss, worth it, we have more. The abundance was the weapon. Everything else, the canvas, the wood, the theatrical precision, was just delivery mechanism for that truth. The stack of reconnaissance photographs grew daily. By May 1944, Major Ernst Hoffmann needed both hands to lift the file. 300 individual shots, cross-referenced with intelligence reports, agent observations, radio intercepts. He'd stopped sleeping properly sometime in March. The morning light through his office window illuminated dust motes drifting across the spread of images. Hoffmann reached for his coffee, found the cup empty, couldn't remember drinking it. His adjutant had stopped commenting on the dark crescents under his eyes. "Show me again," Oberleutnant Weber said from the doorway. The pilot had requested this meeting, had flown in specifically from Abbeville to see what Hoffmann was tracking. Hoffmann began arranging photos: Northern England, Scotland, Southern Coast, East Anglia. Each pin on his wall map represented a confirmed dummy installation: red for airfields, blue for fuel dumps, yellow for troop concentrations. The map looked like it had measles. 237, Hoffmann said. His voice sounded hollow even to himself. That's confirmed fake airfields. Confirmed. There are 47 more we suspect but cannot verify. Weber leaned over the desk. His finger traced the clusters. "You're certain these are all false?" "The photo interpreters are very good at their work now. See this shadow angle? Wrong for the actual roof structure. This dispersal pattern? Too perfect. Real crews. Don't park with such precision. These fuel drums?" Hoffmann pulled another photo. "Painted on the concrete. You can see the brush strokes if you enhance properly." He walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out a ledger. The numbers were written in his own hand, calculated late at night when the implications kept him from sleep. Aircraft. I've catalogued over 2,000 dummy aircraft. Lancasters, 412. B-17s, 681. Spitfires, 309. P-47s. He stopped, started again. They're producing fake fighters faster than we're producing real ones. Weber stared at the ledger. Hoffmann watched the pilot's face go pale. "But it's the other materials that break the mathematics," Hoffmann continued. He heard himself talking faster, the words he'd been holding back for months spilling out. "Fuel dumps, tank formations, artillery parks. I estimate, conservatively, that they've expended enough timber, canvas, and paint to outfit 6 full Wehrmacht divisions with actual equipment." The office went quiet. Outside, a truck backfired. Someone shouted about requisition forms. 6 divisions, Weber repeated. Minimum. The factories producing these items, actual factories running actual shifts, could be manufacturing real weapons instead. The carpenters could be soldiers. The logistics network moving plywood could be transporting ammunition. Hoffman pulled another folder. I've been tracking resource expenditure. Do you know what a convincing dummy Lancaster costs to produce? Weber shook his head. Approximately 150 pounds sterling in materials and labor. Working 48 hours, a team of 6 carpenters can build one. They're using standardized patterns, jigs, assembly line methods. Hoffman laughed, but nothing was funny. They've industrialized deception, mass production of lies. He spread more photos. This installation in Kent appeared in January. We bombed it in February. 18 F-190s, full ammunition load. Photo reconnaissance 3 days later shows it completely rebuilt. Different aircraft positions, some damage that wasn't there before, new details added. They're iterating, getting better at it. The wooden bomb, Weber said quietly. Yes, that marked the change. Before, they were fooling us. After, they were mocking us, making certain we knew we were being fooled, that we were trapped in their game. Hoffman sat down heavily. Do you understand what that means? The strategic calculus? Weber pulled up a chair. Hoffman continued, unable to stop now. An enemy doesn't waste resources on mockery unless they have resources to waste. Every fake airfield is a message. We can afford this. Every dummy tank, we have enough real ones that we can build pretend ones too. The wooden bomb wasn't just humor, it was intelligence. It was them telling us exactly how much they can spare. He pulled out the folder marked Fortitude, the code name his department had assigned to the massive Allied deception operations. Inside were months of compiled data on the 1st United States Army Group, radio intercepts, agent reports, overhead reconnaissance. Patton, Hoffman said, commanding 50 divisions in southeastern England, preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. We've tracked supply movements, identified unit insignia, monitored communication patterns. He paused. It's all theater. Weber blinked. How much? All of it. Every division, every tank park, every airfield. Patton is real. He's the stage manager. But his army? Hoffman gestured at the photos. Inflatable, canvas, plywood, radio operators reading scripts, double agents feeding us fabricated intelligence. It's the wooden bomb at strategic scale. He stood, walked to the window. In the courtyard below, mechanics worked on a BF-109, parts spread across the tarmac. Real machines, growing scarcer every month. We've kept 15 divisions at Calais, Hoffman said. 250,000 men, waiting for Patton's Phantom Army to cross at the narrowest point. Meanwhile, where will they actually invade? Normandy, Weber said. You think Normandy? I've written the report 5 times. Each time, High Command notes my concerns but maintains the Calais disposition. Because the evidence for Patton's army is overwhelming. How could it not be? They've spent more building that lie than we've spent on some real operations. Hoffman turned back to his desk, pulled out one final photograph. The wooden bomb, still sitting in the middle of that fake runway. Someone, British sense of humor, had added fresh paint to it monthly. It had become a landmark. Wood for wood, Weber read. They were answering a question we didn't know we'd asked. The question, how much can you afford to waste? The answer, more than you can imagine. Hoffman sat down again. I did the mathematics. Want to hear it? Weber nodded. The resources expended on dummy installations, just the ones I can confirm, exceed the total output of the Krupp factories in Essen for a 3-month period. One dummy airfield costs roughly what we spend equipping a full infantry company. They've built 237. He paused, while simultaneously outproducing us in actual weapons, in actual aircraft, in actual ammunition. The implications hung in the air like smoke. We prepared for their strength, Hoffman said quietly. We never prepared for their excess. For an enemy that could afford to fight the real war while simultaneously conducting multiple fake wars as side projects, as afterthoughts. Weber stood, walked to the map, studied the pins. So many red markers, so many false targets, drawing real attacks, wasting real fuel, real ammunition, real pilot hours. After the war, Weber said, someone should preserve one of these dummy aircraft, put it in a museum. Why? So people remember this, that we didn't just lose to better tactics or better weapons, we lost, to abundance so complete that waste became a weapon. Weber touched one of the photographs. That wooden bomb should sit next to a real one. Show them side by side. Let people decide which was more effective. Hoffman almost smiled. The fake one tied down more German resources. Exactly. They stood there in the dusty morning light, surrounded by evidence of an enemy so wealthy in material that they could afford to spend fortunes on illusions. Outside, someone was shouting about fuel rationing. The mechanics had stopped working on the BF-109, missing parts, probably, waiting for supplies that might not come. Hoffman looked at his ledger one more time. The numbers hadn't changed. They never would. You couldn't calculate your way out of fighting an enemy that could industrialize deception while still winning the conventional war. The wooden bomb sat in its photograph, freshly painted, mocking them across the miles. Wood for wood. Hoffman said to no one in particular. They told us exactly what they were doing. We just couldn't afford to believe it. The plywood Lancaster stands under gallery lights, its canvas wing sagging after 33 years. Klaus Weber moves closer, ignoring the velvet rope, and runs his fingers along the wooden longerons. The paint is cracking now, peeling away to reveal grain underneath. He can see the seams where sections join. Rough work, done fast. We could knock one together in 2 days, Arthur Wood says beside him, breathing harder than he should. 72 years old, Carpenter's hands still thick with calluses. 48 hours from raw timber to that. Weber pulls his hand back from the exhibit. How many did you build? Me personally? 400 and change. Lost count after Colchester. Woods taps the fuselage, the hollow thunk echoing. Had patterns, see? Jigs. Cut all the ribs identical, assemble like furniture. I had a crew of 8. We'd start Monday morning, have 5 Lancasters standing by Wednesday tea. The museum is quiet around them. A Tuesday afternoon, sparse attendance. School children cluster around a Spitfire 2 galleries over, their voices distant. Weber studies the dummy aircraft, seeing it differently now. Not a prop, a product. Manufactured. Industrialized. I shot one of yours, he says. September 1943, Calais area. Could have been mine. Woods grins, showing tobacco-stained teeth. I did a dozen for that site. You lot kept knocking them down, we kept rebuilding. Officers called it job security. Weber remembers the canvas shredding under his cannon fire, the British ground crew laughing, waving that wooden propeller blade. His 40 fighters circling uselessly while fuel gauges dropped toward red. The laughing, Weber says. That was the worst part. You were enjoying it. Course we were. Woods leads him around the Lancaster's tail section, pointing out construction details. Every raid you flew on our dummies was one you didn't fly on the real bases. Every shell you put through plywood was one less hitting actual aircraft. We saved lives with carpentry. The math is simple now, obvious, but in 1943, it had been incomprehensible. Weber looks at the placard. One of approximately 2,000 dummy aircraft constructed across Britain, 1941 to 1944, used to draw Luftwaffe attacks from operational airfields. 2,000 fake planes. He tries to imagine the workshops, the timber yards, the paint supplies, the organization required. What I never understood, Weber says, is why you didn't just build real aircraft with all that effort. Woods stops walking, turns to face him directly. We were, mate. Thousands of them. He pulls out a battered notebook from his jacket, habit of a carpenter, always carrying measurements, calculations. Flips to a page covered in faded pencil marks. Look here, 1943, right? When you were shooting up my handiwork? Woods's finger traces the numbers. British aircraft production that year, 20,000 planes, Lancasters, Spitfires, Mosquitoes, Proper combat aircraft. That's in Britain alone, not counting American factories. The number sits between them like a physical thing. 20,000, Weber repeats. Give or take. Meanwhile, my entire decoy program, all 237 fake airfields, every dummy plane, every plywood fuel truck, cost about 3 million quid. You know what that bought? Weber shakes his head. Equipment for maybe 150 real bombers. That's it. We ran the entire deception operation. 2 years of work, hundreds of sites, thousands of dummies, for less than 1 week's production cost. Woods taps the notebook. These weren't instead of real planes. They were the extra thing we did with the scraps. Weber feels something shift in his chest. The same sensation as 1944, watching reconnaissance photos of Fortitude's phantom armies, but inverted now. Not horror at Allied abundance, something closer to awe. The scraps, he says quietly. Leftover timber from aircraft crates, canvas from damaged wings, paint batches that didn't quite match specifications. Woods gestures at the Lancaster. We built an entire Shadow Air Force from materials that would have gone to waste anyway. Employed carpenters too old for combat, workers from reserved occupations. The whole operation was surplus. The museum feels smaller suddenly. Weber looks at the other displays. A real Lancaster suspended from the ceiling, gleaming under spotlights. Next to this plywood imposter, the difference is obvious. But from 500 meters altitude, through a gun sight with flak bursting around you and fuel running low, I lost pilots attacking these, Weber says. Not many. Your flak was deliberately weak, I noticed, but some. Engine failures during low-level runs. One mid-air collision during a raid on the Colchester field. Woods nods slowly. We lost some, too. Soldiers guarding the sites. The Luftwaffe strafed a crew at Abbeville, remember? That was real blood. On fake tarmac. I wasn't there, but I knew the pilot. Braun. It destroyed him. War of waste, Woods says. Both sides spending lives on things that didn't matter, except they did matter because of what they prevented. He's quiet a moment. I met one of your blokes after the war. Photographer, reconnaissance pilot. He'd taken hundreds of pictures of my sites, tracking which ones got repaired, which ones we abandoned. Smart lad. He said the thing that broke him wasn't the deception. It was the speed. Speed? How fast we rebuilt. He'd photograph a site bombed to splinters Tuesday morning. Wednesday afternoon, his photos would show it restored. New planes, new facilities, everything fresh. He knew it was impossible to rebuild that quickly unless we had unlimited materials and labor just waiting around. Woods smiles grimly. Which we did. That's what the photos really showed. Not fake airfields. Real abundance. Weber remembers Hoffman's office in June 1944. The major surrounded by reconnaissance images, doing calculations that didn't make sense. Factories producing props instead of weapons. Carpenters who could be soldiers. Paint that could be camouflage. All wasted deliberately, strategically, because the waste itself was the weapon. The wooden bomb, Weber says. That was you? Woods's grin returns. Not my idea, but I built it. 6 feet of solid oak. Took me 8 hours. Painted it myself. Proper RAF olive drab. Even did the stenciling. Holtz for Holtz. My German officer friend suggested the wording. Wanted to make sure you'd understand the joke. We understood. Did you? Because the joke wasn't we tricked you. The joke was we can afford to play games while you're dying. Woods's voice has an edge now. That bomb cost maybe 2 quid in materials and 1 day's labor, but it tied up Luftwaffe intelligence for months. Your high command couldn't decide if it was mockery or some kind of coded message. Photo analysts examined it from every angle. Some genius theorized it might be a real bomb with a wooden casing. Weber had seen those reports. The paranoia spreading through headquarters as every Allied action became suspect. Every piece of intelligence potentially manufactured. When truth became unreliable, decisions became impossible. The Pas-de-Calais deception, Weber says. Fortitude. That was the same principle, wasn't it? Just bigger. Same principle. Bigger scale. Woods closes his notebook. Inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, false radio traffic, Patton commanding an army that existed only on paper and in German reports. We kept 15 of your divisions sitting in the wrong place while the real invasion happened somewhere else, all from scraps and cleverness and actors playing soldiers. 250,000 men, Weber says, waiting for ghosts. While we landed at Normandy with everything real, Woods looks at the plywood Lancaster with something like affection. This bird here, she never flew, never dropped a bomb, never shot down a German fighter. But she tied up resources, drew fire, created uncertainty. In her way, she fought. Weber understands now why he needed to come here, why he'd written to Woods after seeing the museum announcement. Not for reconciliation, they were never personal enemies. Not for closure, some wounds don't close, but for comprehension, to finally grasp what had beaten him. Not tactics, not courage, not even technology, though that mattered. Waste, the ability to waste at industrial scale, to build entire fake armies as footnotes to real operations, to dedicate factories to producing lies while simultaneously outproducing the enemy in everything that actually mattered, to play elaborate jokes with resources that could equip divisions. I became a commercial pilot after the war, Weber says. Lufthansa, flew 707s to New York. Every time we crossed the Atlantic, I'd look down at the ocean and think about what came across during the war. The ships, the men, the material, rivers of steel flowing east while we were rationing bullets. I stayed a carpenter, Woods says, built houses in Essex. Good work, honest work. But nothing I've built since matches what we did here, making something from nothing that changed everything. They stand in silence, two old men flanking a monument to abundance disguised as deception. A museum guide approaches, young woman, bright smile, clipboard. Mr. Woods, the school group is ready for your talk. They're very excited to hear about building the dummy aircraft. Woods nods, then looks at Weber. Want to come? Tell your side? Weber considers the plywood Lancaster one more time, sees beyond it to that September afternoon in 1943, canvas wings shredding, British soldiers laughing, his worldview cracking like dried paint. Yes, he says. They should hear both sides, the ones who built the illusions and the ones who believed them. As they walk toward the education wing, Wood says quietly, "You know what I tell them? About why we won? Tell me." Because we could afford to be wrong, could afford to waste, could afford to try stupid ideas like wooden bombs and see what happened. Your side couldn't afford mistakes. Every mission had to count. Every bullet mattered. That's not a way to win wars. That's a way to lose them slowly. The school children are waiting, faces eager, notebooks ready.